The fluorescent lights of the grocery store cast harsh shadows across Marcus Thompson's face as he stared at the receipt in his trembling hands. $127.84. His eyes darted between the total and his banking app, showing a balance of $43.16. Behind him, his two young children, Emma, 7, and Lucas, 5, stood quietly, having learned months ago that grocery store visits often ended with putting items back. Since Sarah's passing, these moments had become all too familiar. "Daddy, can we keep the cereal?" Emma whispered, her small hand clutching the box of Cheerios like a lifeline. Marcus swallowed hard, the lump in his throat growing larger. That's when a familiar voice cut through the tension. "T-Man, everything okay over here?" Marcus looked up to find Joe Rogan, the Joe Rogan, standing there in a simple black t-shirt and jeans, a genuine look of concern on his face. The podcast host had been quietly shopping in the same aisle, witnessing the entire scene unfold. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories about everyday heroes and acts of kindness that change lives, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. Marcus tried to brush it off, embarrassment coloring his cheeks. "Yeah, just need to put some things back." He reached for the cereal in Emma's hands, but Joe stepped forward. "Let me help," Joe said, his voice carrying that same authenticity that had made him one of the most trusted voices in media. But Marcus shook his head, pride wrestling with desperation. "I appreciate it, but I can't accept." "Listen," Joe interrupted, placing a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. "I've been there, man. Single mom raised me. There were times when we didn't know where our next meal was coming from. Sometimes the universe puts people in your path for a reason." The sincerity in Joe's eyes broke through Marcus's last defenses. Here was a man who'd built an empire, yet hadn't forgotten his roots. As tears threatened to spill, Marcus shared his story, how his wife Sarah's battle with cancer had drained their savings, how he'd taken on extra shifts at the warehouse but still couldn't quite make ends meet, how he'd skipped meals to ensure his kids could eat. Joe listened intently, his trademark curiosity and empathy on full display. Then, without hesitation, he pulled out his phone. "First thing we're doing is paying for these groceries," Joe stated matter-of-factly. "But that's just the beginning. I've got some friends at a nonprofit that helps single parents get back on their feet. They provide job training, childcare assistance, the whole 9 yards." As Joe spoke with the cashier, Emma tugged on Marcus's sleeve. "Daddy, isn't he the funny man from your phone?" Marcus nodded, still processing the surreal moment. He'd fallen asleep to countless episodes of the Joe Rogan Experience, finding solace in the lengthy conversations during lonely nights after the kids were in bed. But Joe wasn't done. He turned back to Marcus, his eyes lighting up with that familiar spark his podcast listeners would recognize, the one that appeared when he was about to dive deep into a topic that fascinated him. "You know what? I'm recording a podcast tomorrow. Why don't you come on as a guest? We can talk about the challenges single parents face, maybe set up a fundraiser for others in similar situations. Your story needs to be heard." Marcus felt his world shift. Just hours ago, he'd been counting pennies, wondering how he'd make it through another week. Now, standing in a grocery store with Joe Rogan, he glimpsed a future where things might actually be okay. The evening air hung heavy with the weight of memories as Marcus stood in the checkout line. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with an intensity that seemed to mirror his racing thoughts. His worn leather wallet felt impossibly light in his calloused hands, hands that told the story of countless overtime shifts at the warehouse, of gentle bedtime stories read to his children, of holding Sarah's hand through those final, precious moments in the hospital. Sarah's presence lingered in every corner of their lives, even here in the sterile aisles of the grocery store. She had been the one who always remembered which cereals the kids preferred, who could stretch a grocery budget like magic, who made even the simplest meals feel like celebrations. Now, 18 months after her passing, Marcus still found himself reaching for her favorite brands, hearing her laugh echo in his memory as he passed the ice cream section, where she'd always sneak an extra pint into their cart. Emma's golden brown hair, so much like her mother's, caught the harsh store lighting as she shifted nervously from foot to foot. She'd inherited more than just Sarah's looks. There was a quiet strength in her that emerged in the hardest moments, a desire to protect and care for others that sometimes broke Marcus's heart. At 7, she'd already learned to be the buffer between her younger brother and the harsh realities of their new life. Lucas, his thumb unconsciously finding its way to his mouth. The habit that had returned after Sarah's passing pressed closer to his sister. At 5, he still struggled to understand why Mommy wasn't coming back. Why Daddy looked so tired all the time. Why they couldn't have the same snacks their friends had at school. His kindergarten teacher had called last week, concerned about his withdrawal during playtime, his tendency to draw pictures filled with dark clouds and rain. The small family unit had grown tighter in their grief, like stars drawing together in the vast emptiness of space. They developed their own language of comfort, small touches, shared looks, quiet moments of connection that helped them navigate the void Sarah's absence had left behind. That's when Joe Rogan stepped forward, his presence both commanding and companionable. The podcast host's eyes, known for their intensity during interviews, now held a gentle understanding that spoke of personal experience with struggle. His simple black t-shirt and jeans stood in stark contrast to his immense success, a testament to the authenticity that had made him a trusted voice for millions. "Let me help," Joe said, his voice carrying that same genuineness that had built his empire. But Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest, pride wrestling with necessity, dignity grappling with desperation. He thought of the hours he'd spent listening to Joe's podcast during his night shifts at the warehouse, finding comfort in the lengthy conversations that made the solitude more bearable. The story of how Marcus had reached this point unfolded naturally in the conversation that followed. He spoke of Sarah, brilliant, beautiful Sarah, who taught second grade until the diagnosis changed everything, of how she'd insisted on finishing the school year even as the treatments drained her energy, unwilling to abandon her kids until she absolutely had to, of the aggressive cancer that had devoured their savings as quickly as it had consumed her strength, of the nights spent researching medical trials while listening to Joe's podcast, finding solace in the lengthy discussions that made the darkness feel less lonely. Joe listened with the same focused attention he brought to his interviews, but there was something more personal in his engagement. He shared his own story of growing up with a single mother, of understanding the weight of empty cupboards and unpaid bills. As he spoke, Emma and Lucas emerged from their shells, drawn to the warmth and authenticity in his voice. "You know what the beautiful thing about struggle is?" Joe mused, his hand resting thoughtfully on the grocery cart. "It teaches you to recognize it in others, to see past the surface to the story underneath. When I was a kid, man, there were times when someone stepping in to help made all the difference. Not just with the immediate need, but with hope, knowing someone out there cared enough to notice." The conversation deepened as Joe spoke about his own journey, not just to success, but to understanding the responsibility that came with it. He talked about the importance of building genuine connections, of using platform and privilege to create real change in people's lives. His words carried the weight of experience, of lessons learned through years of conversations with people from all walks of life. Marcus found himself opening up about the smaller struggles that compounded the larger ones. The parent-teacher conferences he had to miss because of work, the birthday parties they couldn't afford to attend, the way Emma had started mothering Lucas, taking on responsibilities no 7-year-old should have to bear. He spoke of the guilt that aided him when he had to say no to simple requests, of the nights he lay awake wondering if he was failing his children, of the crushing loneliness of facing it all without Sarah. "Sometimes," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, "I still reach for my phone to call her when something good happens with the kids. Then I remember." He trailed off, but Joe nodded in understanding. The podcast host had interviewed countless people about loss and grief, but this moment in the grocery store felt more real, more raw than any studio conversation. Joe's response was immediate and multifaceted. Not only did he cover the groceries, but he began laying out a plan that would address the root causes of Marcus's struggles. He made calls to contacts at a nonprofit specializing in support for single parents, reached out to friends who could offer job opportunities with better hours and benefits, and insisted on Marcus appearing on his podcast to share his story. "This isn't just about groceries," Joe explained. his enthusiasm building as he outlined his vision. This is about breaking the cycle. Your story, man. It needs to be heard. Not just for you, but for all the other parents out there facing the same battles alone. The podcast recording the next day became a turning point, not just for Marcus, but for countless others in similar situations. The familiar studio, with its professional lighting and state-of-the-art equipment, initially intimidated Marcus. But as he settled into the conversation with Joe, the environment faded into the background, and his story flowed naturally. Young Jamie, Joe's longtime producer, worked his technical magic while simultaneously setting up a GoFundMe page. As Marcus spoke, donations began pouring in, but more importantly, so did stories from others who saw themselves in his experience. The comment section became a testament to the universal nature of struggle and the power of shared humanity. Emma and Lucas sat in a comfortable corner of the studio, provided with snacks and tablets to keep them occupied. But as their father spoke, they found themselves drawn to his words, hearing for the first time the full extent of his struggles and his love for them. Emma particularly seemed transfixed, watching her father transform from someone weighed down by circumstance into someone whose story had value, whose experience could help others. Previous content remains exactly the same through the studio scene. Then continues the conversation flowed naturally into deeper waters. Discussions about grief, about the role of community in healing, about the importance of maintaining dignity while accepting help. Joe's trademark curiosity led them to explore the systemic issues that often trap single parents in cycles of poverty, but also to celebrate the resilience of those who refuse to give up. You know what strikes me about your story? Joe mused during a particularly powerful moment. It's not just about loss or struggle. It's about how we show up for each other, how the smallest gesture can change someone's entire trajectory. Marcus nodded, thinking of Sarah and how she would have appreciated this moment. She always said that kindness was like a pebble in a pond. He shared. You never know how far the ripples will reach. As the podcast recording wrapped up, Joe's network had already begun to mobilize. Financial advisors offered their services pro bono, job opportunities materialized, and the nonprofit connections began opening doors that had seemed permanently closed. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus found himself part of a community that understood his struggles and celebrated his strengths. The impact rippled outward in unexpected ways. Other podcasters and influencers began seeking out similar stories in their communities, creating a network of support that transcended geographical boundaries. The nonprofit Joe had connected Marcus with saw an unprecedented surge in both donations and volunteers, allowing them to expand their services to reach more families in crisis. Within weeks, Marcus had started a new job with better hours and benefits, allowing him to be more present for his children. The financial advisors helped him create a sustainable budget and start a small savings account for the first time since Sarah's illness. But more than the practical help, it was the restoration of hope that made the biggest difference. Emma's teacher noticed the change first. The little girl's drawings, once dominated by dark colors and solitary figures, began to fill with bright hues and groups of people holding hands. She started participating more in class, sharing stories about her mom, without the same heavy sadness that had weighted her words before. Lucas, too, showed signs of healing. His thumb-sucking decreased, replaced by an emerging interest in the martial arts videos Joe had shared with him. During one of Joe's visits to check on the family, he noticed Lucas attempting to mimic some basic moves he'd seen online. You know what, little man? Joe said, kneeling down to Lucas's level. I think you might have a natural talent there. How about we set you up with some proper lessons? The boy's face lit up with an enthusiasm Marcus hadn't seen since before Sarah's passing. It was more than just an interest in martial arts. It was the first time Lucas had allowed himself to get excited about something, to look forward rather than backward. The support group that formed in the wake of the podcast episode became a lifeline for dozens of other single parents in similar situations. Meeting in a local community center every Tuesday evening, they shared resources, watched each other's children, and provided the emotional support that only those who had walked the same path could offer. Joe often dropped by these meetings, sitting quietly in the back, listening to the stories of struggle and triumph. He never sought attention or credit, preferring to let the community take ownership of their space. but his presence served as a reminder that someone with his platform and influence chose to use it not for personal gain, but for genuine human connection and support. The transformation in Marcus's life sparked something larger than anyone could have anticipated. His story, shared through Joe's platform, became a catalyst for change in communities across the country. Other podcast hosts and influencers began reaching out, asking how they could replicate the support system in their own cities. The beautiful thing about what's happening, Joe explained during a follow-up episode 6 months later, is that it's not about me anymore. It's about people recognizing themselves in each other's stories and realizing they have the power to help. Marcus had found his voice as an advocate. The quiet warehouse worker who once struggled to ask for help was now speaking at community events, sharing his experience with other single parents, and working with local organizations to create better support systems. His natural empathy, combined with his first-hand understanding of the struggles, made him an effective bridge between those in need and those who could help. Emma's artistic talents, which had been suppressed by their financial circumstances, flourished in the after-school program she could now attend. Her art teacher noticed a transformation in her work, the dark, somber colors giving way to brighter hues, her drawings telling stories of hope and connection rather than isolation. "Look, Daddy," she exclaimed one afternoon, proudly holding up a painting. "It's our family." The picture showed not just Marcus, Emma, and Lucas, but also included Joe, members from their support group, and a bright figure in the sky that Emma explained was her mom watching over them all. Lucas's development was equally remarkable. The martial arts classes Joe had suggested became more than just a hobby. They were a path to healing. Under the guidance of a patient instructor, personally recommended by Joe, Lucas learned not just physical techniques, but valuable lessons about discipline, resilience, and the importance of getting back up after falling. "You know what I love about martial arts?" Joe explained during one of his visits to watch Lucas's practice. "It teaches you that falling down isn't failure. It's just part of learning to stand back up stronger." The community center where the support group met had transformed as well. What started as a simple meeting space became a hub of activity and hope. Local businesses, inspired by Joe's example, began offering services and support. A nearby daycare provided free childcare during group meetings. A local restaurant sent healthy meals. A law firm offered pro bono legal services for parents navigating custody issues or estate planning. The ripple effect continued to spread. Marcus's story had touched something universal, the understanding that everyone, no matter their circumstances, deserved dignity and support. The nonprofit organization that Joe had initially connected him with expanded its programs, using the lessons learned from Marcus's case to help more families effectively. One particularly moving moment came when Marcus received a letter from a single father in Texas. The man had been on the verge of giving up, overwhelmed by circumstances similar to what Marcus had faced. After hearing the podcast episode, he found the courage to reach out for help. Now, months later, he was running his own support group and helping others in his community. "Your story saved my life," the letter read, "and now it's saving others too." Joe, true to his nature, continued to use his platform to amplify these stories of transformation and hope. But he always redirected the credit back to the community members who were doing the daily work of supporting each other. "What we're seeing here," he said during another podcast discussion about the movement that had grown from that chance encounter in the grocery store, "is what happens when we stop treating each other like statistics and start seeing each other as human beings with stories, with potential, with worth." Previous content remains exactly the same through the podcast discussion, then continues 1 year later, when Marcus returned to Joe's podcast for their anniversary episode. The transformation was remarkable. The man who had once stood trembling in a grocery store now sat confidently in the studio, sharing not just his own journey, but the stories of countless others whose lives had been touched by the movement that grew from that chance encounter. "You know what amazes me?" Joe reflected during the recording. "How the right moment of connection can change everything, not just for one person or family, but for an entire community. It's like what you said about Sarah's ripples in the pond." Marcus nodded, thinking of all the lives touched by that simple decision to reach out on a difficult day. "The real power," G added, "isn't showing people they're not alone. That's what you did for me, Joe. You showed me I wasn't alone. Emma, now 8, had started her own project at school, organizing a food drive for families in need. Her teacher marveled at how she could spot the kids who might be going through hard times, how she'd quietly share her lunch or offer words of encouragement. She was her mother's daughter in ways that made Marcus's heart both ache and swell with pride. I remember how it feels when you're scared about food, she explained to her class during her presentation. But I also remember how it feels when someone helps you. And that feeling, that's the one I want other kids to have. Lucas, at 6, had earned his first belt in martial arts, his previous anxiety replaced by a growing confidence. His nightmares had become rare, and when they did come, he had new tools to handle them. Mr. Joe taught me that being strong isn't about not being scared, he told his therapist. It's about what you do when you are scared. The support group that had started with just a handful of parents now filled the community center every week. They developed a comprehensive program that included childcare, job search assistance, and emotional support. More importantly, it created a space where people could be vulnerable, could admit their struggles without shame, could find strength in shared experience. Marcus's nonprofit, Sarah's Ripples, had grown beyond his wildest dreams. Working in partnership with Joe's network and local organizations, they'd helped hundreds of families avoid the brink of crisis. But more than just providing practical assistance, they'd created a model for community support that was being replicated across the country. As Marcus stood in that same grocery store 1 year later, confidently checking out with a cart full of groceries, he caught his reflection in the glass door. He saw not just himself, but the echo of that desperate father he'd been, and all the other parents out there still struggling. His phone buzzed with a text from Joe, another family in need, another opportunity to pay it forward. A message read, "Gee brother, got someone you should meet. Single mom, 2 kids, similar situation to where you were. Your story might be exactly what she needs to hear right now. Coffee tomorrow?" Emma tugged at his sleeve, just as she had that fateful day. But this time, instead of asking to keep the cereal, she said something that made his heart swell. "Daddy, can we help them like Mr. Joe helped us? I saved some of my allowance." Lucas looked up from his martial arts practice book. "Dadding, I can show their kids my special moves that help with bad dreams." Marcus knelt down to his children's level, seeing in their eyes the same compassion that had changed their lives. "We already are, sweetheart. We already are. And you know what? Your mom would be so proud of you both right now." Standing under those same fluorescent lights that had once seemed so harsh, Marcus understood something profound. The greatest gift Joe Rogan had given them wasn't just the financial help or the connections. It was the reminder that every person has the power to be someone else's miracle, to be the hand that reaches out in the darkness and says, "You're not alone." The story continues to inspire, not because it's about a celebrity's generosity, but because it shows how one person's compassion can ignite a chain reaction of positive change. It stands as a reminder that within each of us lies the power to transform lives, whether we have a platform of millions or simply the courage to reach out to someone in need. In the end, it wasn't just about Joe Rogan noticing a struggling father in a grocery store. It was about all of us learning to truly see each other, to recognize our shared humanity in moments of vulnerability, and to understand that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create the biggest changes of all. As Sarah had always said, ripples in a pond, reaching further than we could ever imagine, touching lives we might never meet, creating waves of change that continue long after that first stone is cast. And in that grocery store, under those fluorescent lights, a new ripple began, carrying hope and healing to shores yet unseen.